Before Bishop Justin speaks, we're going to hear the story of Tarore of Wellington, one of the saints of the church in Aotearoa, New Zealand, whom we remember this day. Over 150 years ago, the Maori had the Gospel of Luke in their own language, but many could not read. A 12-year-old girl named Tarore, who'd been taught to read by CMS missionaries, brought the good news of Jesus to her people, the Waikato iwi of Ngāti Hawa. Tarore's greatest treasure was the Gospel of Luke, which she kept in a little flax kete around her neck. Each evening after the day's work was done, her father, Chief Nakuku, and his people would gather to listen as Tarore read to them.
Words of the Spirit of God.
Forgive others, and God will forgive you. If your brother sins against you 7 times in one day, and each time he comes to you saying, I am sorry, you must forgive him.
Tarore, my daughter, as you read these words, the Spirit of God speaks to me.
Yes, Father, Jesus speaks to me too. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as you love yourself.
As Chief Nakuku listened, he realised that this book was more than just words. God told him that he'd sent his son Jesus to die for everyone and to save us all, including the Maori people. So both Nakuku and Tarore became followers of Jesus as God's life-changing power began to work through Tarore's little book. But a great trouble was ahead for them in 1836.
Chief Nakuku, we are in deep trouble. The Rotorua tribe have been raiding Pa along the Waikato River. We could be next. We must get away.
I must take our children to safety in Tauranga.
Nakuku decided to take a few warriors and all 20 of the children from his pa to Tauranga. His uncle had a pa there, which was well protected with many warriors. They would be safe there. However, the tribe's journey to Tauranga was interrupted. One night, the 19th of October, while they were camping in the Kaimai Ranges, the smoke of their campfire attracted a raiding party from Rotorua, a raiding party led by Chief Uita. Chief Nakuku heard them approaching and managed to rescue his little son and some of the others. He moved them into the bushes out of sight. The battle was on as the warriors burst into their campsite. It was very quick but very terrible. When it was over, Nakuku checked to see if anybody was missing. Tarore, where was Tarore? Oh no, she was dead, and the little flax kete which hung around her neck was gone. The warriors called for utu, revenge. Tarore has been killed. We will kill their daughters too.
No, we will follow the words of Tarore's book. The great God in heaven, whom I have learned to love, will take care of revenge.
Meanwhile, Tarore's little book had found its way into the pa of the Rotorua tribe. On the night of the raid, Chief Uita had stolen it. At first he tossed the book aside, expecting to find greenstone or something of much more value. Uita could not read, so what use was a book to him? Sometime later, though, the little book was picked up by a slave named Ripaho, who was passing through Rotorua. He had learnt to read, so once again Tarore's little book began to speak to the listeners who gathered around to hear Ripaho read it. Even Chief Uita listened as Ripaho read about Jesus and God's love for all people.
Do for others just what you want them to do for you. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you.
As the slave Ripaho read from Luke's Gospel, God's word went right to Chief Uita's heart.
Ripaho, as you read these words, the Spirit of God speaks to me. I will become a follower of Jesus. I will go to Chief Nakuku. I will tell him I am sorry for killing his daughter, and I will ask for his forgiveness."
So Ita went to Nakuku and apologized for the murder of Tarore, and Nakuku forgave him for Tarore's death. Her little book had brought the two chiefs together in peace, and they knelt and prayed together. The slave Ripaho left Rotorua and travelled south to Otaki on the Kapiti coast. There he met Tamahana, son of the great Otaki chief Toropraha. Ripaho taught Tamahana to read from Tarore's Gospel. Chief Toropraha was a fierce warrior and everybody feared him. But his son Tamahana was beginning to change.
"I do not want war. I want to follow the way of peace."
Tamahana taught his people from Tarore's Gospel. He travelled up to the Bay of Islands to bring back a missionary to teach the people more about Jesus. He came back with Octavius Hadfield, a priest who worked for many years amongst the Maori and Pākehā and Otaki. Once Chief Toropraha was planning to destroy the Pākehā settlement in Wellington, but Octavius Hadfield pleaded with him and made peace. Gradually, even Chief Toropraha began to change his ways. He became a Christian and supervised the building of the great Maori church Rangiatia at Otaki. Octavius Hadfield later became the second Bishop of Wellington. So Tarore's Gospel of Luke went on a long pilgrimage through the North Island and brought the good news of Jesus from Waikato to Rotorua, down to Otaki, and down to Wellington. We thank God for Tarore's Gospel and for Tarore's witness today.
May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight. Amen. Good morning. It is lovely to be here today again with you. Before we go on to talking about penal reform and the week that's been, I feel like I have to clear up one vicious rumour that I've heard is circulating our diocese. I personally put it down to Archdeacon Bernard Fall or his offsider Gareth Bizet. The rumour is that now we know the bishop can live in a 10 square metre cabin. When he shifts into Wellington in 6 weeks' time with his wife, they will not be needing Bishop's Court, and instead we can rent it out and just give them a 10 square metre cabin. I would like to clarify that I'm happy to talk to Dean-elect Digby and his wife Jane and see if I can persuade them as well, and we can get 2 cabins for the price of 1. I must say though, I was sitting there in the cabin this morning listening to the church bells, the cathedral bells, and I suddenly thought, this isn't actually the worst accommodation I've ever had. I've lived in a student flat. Actually, it wasn't even a student flat, it was a student outhouse. I don't know what came over me, but everybody else got the house and I got this little bit outside, about the size of the cabin actually, and it was in Lyell Bay. And I remember what would happen is, if you don't know, Lyell Bay is a little bit windy place and sandstorms are a regular feature. The problem with my little outhouse is the door wouldn't close. So whenever there was a sandstorm, there would be a pile of sand on my concrete floor by the door waiting for me to clean up. That wasn't the worst part though. The worst part was when it rained, because the rain would run down the walls and form puddles on the concrete floor, and I'd get up and I'd put my feet into the puddles of water. See, in those days we didn't have the language of leaky buildings. Instead, we just called them student flats. I remember this flat because we did have a bath, I remember, but I remember we put all our wetsuits in the bathtub so it was no longer operable. We put our wetsuits in there because we were wannabe surfers. Not that I think any of us ever caught a wave the whole year. So what I would do is I'd run to university each day, have a shower, then run home, and I'd have a shower at Lyell Bay Surf Club and then walk home dripping wet to my home to dry off. So I want to say that the 10 square metre cabin this week has been absolute luxury compared to my student flatting days. In October last year, the House of Bishops met. And those that were present, we felt inspired to look into the issue of penal reform because we had many concerns. We had a professional researcher spend over 30 days researching the sector, talking to the knowledgeable people, reading the literature. Even I went to some of the meetings with some of the key stakeholders, and from those meetings and from the 30 days of extensive research, what we gathered was 6 themes that we thought as a church we could do better on. These are 6 themes that we thought us as individuals and as a church could be involved in. The themes were the causes of crime, restoration or retribution, looking at alternatives to prison sentences, the treatment of prisoners, the children of prisoners who are the innocent victims, and prisoner reintegration. Going through all these was a recognition that in order to cut reoffending in the future, we recognised that there was a limit to a punishment-based approach. In only a small amount of cases does punishment actually work to stop reoffending. 2/3 of those that come out of our prisons reoffend within 2 years. 2/3 reoffend within 2 years. A punishment-based approach has severe limitations. We realised that we had to move to a restorative approach. We realised that we could do better. We were not pointing the finger at anyone. However, what we were saying as a church, we as individuals and as a church need to take responsibility as followers of Jesus to do better. We realised that as followers of Jesus, we followed one who committed his life not to condemning the world, but to saving the world. He lived a life of reconciliation, restoration, and redemption. I personally felt invited by God as a response to embark on a prayer vigil. For the week, I have been in the cabin, and over that week, I've had a list on the wall of all the prisons and all the individual cells of the people in this country. Over the week, I've prayed for about 8,000 cells. I've prayed for the victims first, I've prayed for the inmates, and I've prayed for the respective families and prayed for healing and restoration. Finally, I prayed in each case that we could create communities where we no longer need to live in fear. Each day I celebrated daily Eucharist outside, which was amazingly well attended, and it was such a encouragement to me that people were concerned about this issue. It was another blessing to me that the service we used each day was actually the service I use at home at Ngāti Awa. And so for me it felt each day as I took communion that in reality I was at home. Normally we do it in the chapel of Tarore at our place. We were lucky enough that the iwi of Ngāti Hoa gave us permission for the name of Tarore to use. You have heard the story of Tarore today. The story of Tarore is an amazing story that has permeated our country. I want to focus though on the fact that different ones in the story had choices to make. They had choices to make between living in fear and punishment or restoration and healing. Chief Ngākuku, Tarore's father, chose not fear and punishment, not utu, but instead restoration and healing. Chief Uita, he chose instead of living in fear and punishment, he chose instead restoration and healing by seeking reconciliation. And so the bloodshed stopped. Tamihana Rauparaha, the son of the mighty Te Rauparaha, so empowered by the good news of Jesus, as we've heard, seeked reconciliation. What we didn't hear in the story is also after this, he travelled down the South Island where his father had managed to slaughter numerous Māori down there. Tamihana went down there and sought reconciliation and not revenge. The fruit of their choices today still ripple out to us. These three individuals, inspired by the gospel of Jesus Christ, chose not to live in fear and punishment, but instead to restore and to heal, and we live in that benefit. We are constantly faced as people by the question, which story will we choose to live by? Will we choose to live by fear and punishment, or will we choose to live by restoration and healing and hope? In 2010, I think it's a UN stat, that there was a research done and New Zealanders and other countries in the world were asked how safe they feel. 57% of New Zealanders feel safe. I found this a strange stat when I compare that in Iran, 55% feel safe. So most people in New Zealand don't feel any safer than they do in Iran. Uganda was 51% felt safe. The USA, 75% felt safe, although they have a 4 times our murder rate. So I did some research. I Googled. I wondered, what is the safest country in the world? And where does New Zealand really rate? I found this site that rated safest countries in 2013. I have no idea how they judge it. You know what surprised me? I found 2 sites. One site had New Zealand in the top 10 safest countries in the world, and one site had it as the safest country in the world. We have to ask ourselves this question: if we are in the top 10, or if we are the safest country in the world, how come only 57% of our people feel safe? The truth is, we are very safe, but we are governed by an overwhelming society spirit of fear. Quoting from the great prophet Fred Dagg, we don't know how lucky we are. So the question is, why is our society so fearful? Why have we got such a warped perspective on how safe our country really is? I'm not going to answer that question. I feel like you need to answer that question. Why are we so fearful? And I recognise it in myself. The other night I was in my cabin, and after the sun goes down you don't have much to do, so you go to bed very early. And I was lying in bed trying to get to sleep, and then suddenly there was a thump on the window. And this is the honest truth. Straight away I thought, somebody's throwing a rotten bit of fruit or an egg at the cabin in disappointment about what I'm doing. And so I spent the night sort of dreading it. I woke up in the morning and I looked out, and instead I found somebody had delivered the paper. What is lovely is not only did they deliver the paper, but they delivered a rusty hacksaw blade. How easy it is for us to live in fear, when in reality is our country is a safe place. And see, in our country, we have other stories other than fear. We have the story of Tarore. We have the story of the courage of a group of people to live by hope and restoration and healing, and we live in the benefits. So that's why we are here as followers of Jesus. In closing, I just want to say this. What can we do as individuals? The first thing I think we can do as individuals is examine our own lives and root out where we are living in fear and not in hope. and guided by Jesus, ask ourselves the question, how can we be involved in reconciliation and restoration in this country? The second thing I want to encourage you to do, and I know that it's not biblical, but I want to encourage you to gossip. I want to encourage you to gossip the good news that our country is a safe country and we need not be governed by fear and punishment. Instead, we can work towards restoration. What is us as the church can do? All around the place over this week, I have met different people who already volunteer in our prison system. Do you know 80% of the people who volunteer in our prison systems are Christians, and many of them are Anglicans? Already we are involved in the prison system at the grassroots, unpaid, trying to work for reconciliation and restoration. Can I encourage you in this work? I talked to one parishioner who said that they were going to go back to their church and encourage their church to be involved in prisoner reintegration. Encourage their church to be a church where prisoners, when they come out of jail, can come to and people can help them find employment and get back on their feet and restore them into society. Finally, I realised that when the church picked up this topic of penal reform, that many people said, about time, good on you, let's go for it. But I also know that as we embarked on this conversation this week, there are many people who instead said, I disagree. What I want to do is thank those people for their courage, because they were really the courageous people, the people who have a differing point of view but still embark in the conversation. To be able to embark on the conversation, although your starting point is one of disagreement, is a courageous thing to do. And this week we have asked ourselves the question, will you embark on this conversation? Will you embark on a conversation about the limits of punishment and instead the hope of a restorative system? Let us pray.